He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
It's dark. His heart's beating fast, and his mind is racing, hoping, waiting. Inside this rua kumara, a large kumara pit, the musty smell is strong. But most of all, it's dark. It's designed that way to keep the stored food fresh and frost-free. It's sometime around 1820. We're at Motuapuhi Pa, near Tauranga in the central North Island. Te Rauparaha, perhaps the most famous of all New Zealand's rangatira, is on the run. And not for the first time.
Word had reached him that his enemies were on his tail, so had headed to Rotoaira, where his relative Te Wharerangi agreed to hide him. So now he's in a pit with Te Wharerangi's wife, Te Rangihaeata, sitting on top, hiding Te Rauparaha from the war party and the tohunga.
Crouched there, maybe as much as 6 feet underground, is a life or death gamble, a chance to evade capture. His life hangs in the balance. Life or death. Life or death. It's this moment that inspires Te Rauparaha to compose what will become the world's most famous haka.
Here's Ngāti Toa leader Kahuropata.
He made his way down there and probably somewhat angst at finding himself in that position, and only he could sort of come out with the gusto and have a whole haka like kamate. I thought I was going to die, I live. Kaora, kaora. And really that's essentially the legacy of Ngāti Toa, is that we only had a dream and a haka.
This time for Te Rauparaha, it was life, kaora. His enemies moved on, and again, he survived.
Te Rauparaha's instinct for survival, shown as he hid in that kumara pit, was the same instinct that would soon see him lead his people south to Kapiti and then across the Cook Strait.
A rise to power during the Musket Wars, forging alliances and trade and marriage with arriving Europeans, an instinct that would eventually see him standing on the Wairau Plains in June 1843 in a showdown with the New Zealand Company. A showdown that would lead to what some would call the first conflict of the New Zealand Wars.
Others call it a forerunner to those wars, which spread through the far north, Taranaki and Waikato in the following decades. But it was at Wairau where confrontation turned to bloodshed.
And then you hear the ringing voice of Arthur Wakefield, and he says, "Englishmen, forward!"
It's a clash that now looks entirely avoidable, sparked by dodgy schemes and even dodgier deeds.
Actual deeds, documents, and a dodgy cannon.
Yeah, and behind it all, a cocktail of greed, ambition, desperation, mana, and fundamentally different ideas about land.
Maori had no concept of individual land ownership. In other words, putting a fence around it, that's mine, But they had no idea that what William Wakefield was really saying was, I'm going to give you this stuff, and then we're going to own all that land.
And it came to literal blows at Wairau in Marlborough on June 17th, 1843. People have given different names to the events of that day. The Wairau Incident, the Wairau Affray, the Wairau Massacre.
Call it what you will, it was a spark, a tipping point. Te Rauparaha was there at the heart of it, trying like so often before to resist, to resolve, to survive. But this time it ended in death. Deaths that cast a shadow over Aotearoa even today. Kia ora, ko Justine Murray aho, no Tauranga Moana aho. I'm from Tauranga in the Bay of Plenty. Now, my connection to the story is through my whakapapa, which I am still learning. My great-great-great-grandfather was Toanui Parata, a Ngāti Toa descendant of Te Rangihaeata pi Toitoi, who was part of the heke from Kawhia to Kapiti that we're going to learn about later.
And I'm William Ray. These days I live in Wellington, but I was born in Hamilton, Kirikiriroa, and my family history mostly goes back to England and Ireland, although thankfully not back to the New Zealand Company settlers who had all these troubles in Wairau. The story of Wairau isn't just about one event. There's so many factors, ideals, language barriers, greed and power that leads us up to that day, and the aftermath.
Aira, this is New Zealand Wars, Stories of Wairau, part 4 of the New Zealand Wars series by RNZ, Aotearoa Media Collective and Great Southern Television, funded by New Zealand On Air.
So just to kind of give us a little bit of geography. So this
is Dr. Peter Meihana of Rangitane, a senior lecturer in Māori history at Massey University. He's showing a group of school kids around one of the most important spots in New Zealand history.
It's probably one of the most, and if you listen to Mr. Orchard, he will always tell you no Marlborough student should leave school without knowing about the affray or the massacre that went on here. So do people kind of know what happened to this place? No. Yep. So the treaty was signed out there 17 June 1840, and this event here took place 17 June 1843. To kind of understand how things happened here, there's a lot of context.
You know, Justine, I just love a bit of context.
I love context too.
Yeah, in this podcast, it's going to be all about that context. Because to really understand what happened there by the Tuamarino stream in Wairau, we need to go back about a century earlier and further north to Waikato in the mid-1700s.
So by that point, Ngāti Toa had lived on the west coast of Waikato for about 4 centuries, since their tupuna arrived on the Tainui canoe.
So one day, Wairau, a chief of Ngāti Toa, visits the Ngāti Rauparaha Koroaputa at his home in Maunga Tautiri, which is near modern-day Cambridge. Wairau was there looking for a wife, and he has his eye on Koroaputa's daughter, Parekohatu. The two are close, and he's kind of feeling down at the prospect of her leaving. Here's Ngāti Toa leader Tā Matthew Te Rei.
Koroaputa made the remark, he says, well, to Wairau says, ko wai ka hua, ko wai ka pohu, ka puta, he tani wha.
That is, she would give birth to either a monster or a leader. Eventually, Wairau and Parekohatu did marry and started a family. Somewhere around 1768 to 1780, their 5th child was born and taken to Koroaputa.
Here's Ngāti Toa leader Kahuropata again.
The old man looked down and saw that he had a special characteristic on his left foot, which was the 6th toe. And then he knew straight away, oh, this is the taniwha, or the leader that he saw in his matakite or in his prophecy.
And that taniwha was, of course, Te Rauparaha.
He was raised as a rangatira and brought up in the whare tūtaua as a war chief eventually.
His physical attributes were perhaps underestimated because he was short, maybe around 5 feet tall, but he made up for that in other ways.
They soon saw that he was very adept at leadership, his prowess in the whare tūtaua, his ability, especially in the use of a taiaha. Apparently had a big booming voice and was able to eventually take over the leadership of Ngāti Toa through the Ngāti Kimi here, hapu of Ngāti Toa, which his father was the main leader of.
Now, there had been long-running disputes between Ngāti Toa and various Waikato iwi, including a very large battle known as Hinga Kaka, sometime around 1780 to 1810. And this may have been the biggest battle ever fought on New Zealand soil.
Here's Sumachu Terei again.
It was a huge battle. It wasn't just Ngāti Toa, and it wasn't just the Kāwhia tribes against it. People called in their, whanaunga from other tribes. So Tauranga was involved, Ngāpuhi was involved, Tūwhare was involved. It's probably the largest ever battle, pre-European battle of Māori. Even though they were related. However, as leadership does, there becomes, challenges between leaders. And so there had always been this ongoing tit for tat.
As Tāmatū points out, Te Rauparaha had seen death and bloodshed all his life.
So at this point you might be thinking, what does any of this stuff have to do with Wairau down near Blenheim?
Well, it's about context, isn't it?
Yes, we love context.
It's like we said, we love context.
Yes.
And Te Rauparaha is a key figure in the Wairau dispute, so it's important to understand his background, how he was born and grew to adulthood in a time of intense conflict.
He became skilled, not just as a warrior and general, but as a diplomat, building and maintaining alliances.
And in between the fighting, Te Rauparaha was also known as a gardener and as a fisherman. So by 1819, Te Rauparaha was about 50 years old, but those constant battles and disputes with Waikato iwi mean he's concerned for the survival of his people. So he plans a heke, a migration.
Te Rauparaha had been on an expedition in 1819 with Ngāpuhi, and then by the time he had got home, the desire to move back down to Te Whanganuiatara ki Te Upoko Tika, ki Kapiti, Manawatu, had really grown within him.
When Te Rauparaha makes his move south in the early 1820s, this time for good, he has the formidable Te Rangihaeata at his side. Now, he's the son of Waitohi, Te Rauparaha's sister. Te Rangihaeata towers over his uncle. Here's Dr. Lloyd Carpenter, a senior lecturer in Māori Studies at Lincoln University, who's also Ngāti Toa.
He was a giant, 6'2", possibly 6'3", wide across the shoulders. He had this enormity that when he came in, and everyone talks about he was a rongoa practitioner, he was a carver, he was a healer, he was a bone setter, and he was a rangatira. So you had this man of mana ageing, and you had his nephew, Te Rangihaeata, who between the two would have been an incredible presence.
So through this point, the 1820s and 30s, there's increasing contact from Europeans, particularly whalers, sealers and missionaries. They're only in small numbers, but they had brought new technologies, most notably including muskets, which had triggered enormous bloodshed.
Te Rangihaeata was a person who wouldn't wear Pakeha clothing. As far as he was concerned, the only good thing that they brought over was guns, tomahawks, and all those things that were used in warfare. And I suppose he was known to have a bit of a liking towards a bit of rum and tobacco. I think was one of the new substances they were using back then. And so he fought his way with Ngāti Toa through all the battles of his people in Kāwhia, all the way down from Kāwhia, and right up until contact with the colonial government.
The heke, the migration, would be really hard going. Remember, Ngāti Toa was a relatively small tribe, so they had to improvise. Like during the first leg to Taranaki, known as Te Heke Tahu Tahu Ahi, or the fire-lighting migration, Te Rauparaha instructed fires be lit at night and cloaks be draped across bushes. This gave the impression the group was larger than it really was to help ward off attack.
They also had the musket.
Every musket had a name. Every musket was carved. Every musket was protected with the firing mechanism, protected with oilskin, finely milled powder. They had carved powder horns. These were taonga.
This small, well-armed tribe would continue pushing south.
The next leg of the migration was named Te Heke Tā Taramoa, or the Campaign of Brambles, named after the prickly bush, a metaphor for the obstacles they faced along the way.
And the obstacles weren't just tough terrain, but the fact they were sometimes moving through enemy territory. Ngāti Toa was joined by allies from Te Atiawa, and the parties thought to have been more than 1,500 strong as it travelled 400 kilometres south.
Battles were fought in Manawatu, Horowhenua and Whakapiti Island, all significant stories in their own right.
Yeah, we need like a whole other podcast series just to cover that.
Exactly, we do. But the key point is this. By 1824, Ngāti Toa had become the dominant force in the lower North Island. Te Rauparaha was later nicknamed Napoleon of the South. He led what's been called a canoe-crafted empire from Kapiti Island.
So Kapiti Island, in case you're not familiar, it's just off the coast around Paraparaumu and Waikanai, and it's key to the story. On that scouting trip south before the Heke, Te Rauparaha had recognised it as a strong defensive position. He'd also noted the European whaling ships passing through the area. Kapiti was to become both his fortress and a key centre of trade.
Through the 1820s and 1830s, Ngāti Toa consolidated its power over neighbouring iwi, in large part through its relationships with the Pakeha world.
Yeah, Kapiti was a place where traders and whalers could get pigs, tobacco, flax and even women in return for tobacco, alcohol and, most importantly, guns. From his island fortress, Te Rauparaha took control of the trade in arms and ammo.
Kapiti Island historian Chris McLean has described it as, quote, a wild frontier, a meeting point of two cultures without the restraints of laws or government. As many as 5 whaling stations were set up on the island.
As you might imagine, trading relationships between Māori and Pakeha in this era could be difficult. There was a big cultural barrier, big language barrier too. And part of the way this was overcome was through marriages.
Marriages were often arranged between ship captains and high-ranking Māori women. That created a whakapapa link which could smooth the path for trading.
And there was one marriage which is really central to the Wairau story. The marriage of a whaler called John William Dundas Blenkinsop, which is an awesome name, and Te Rongo, who was a female rangatira of Ngāti Mutunga, who were closely allied to Ngāti Toa at this point in time.
Te Rongo, in a series of crazy, tragic coincidences, will be the woman right in the middle of this whole story. Here's Media Pōmari.
I'm a mokopuna of Te Rongo. She had 2 marriages. The first marriage was to a whaler and sealer by the name of Captain John Blenkinsop. Her second husband, after Blenkinsop, was Te Rangihaeata.
Now, I wish we could tell you Te Rongo's full story in detail, but there are different versions and different written and oral histories, so it's hard to be definitive.
Yeah, even her name's a little uncertain, right?
Yeah.
So Ngāti Toa historian and Te Papa curator Matthew Baker, he thinks Te Rongo's name was really Te Rongo Pamamao, while media thinks Te Rongo and Te Rongo Pamamao were actually 2 different women.
Yeah, so just to be clear, these kinds of contested details aren't unusual in 19th century history.
Oh, yeah, not at all. And even history which happened way more recently than that can be super controversial.
So we'll try to tell her story as best we can, but just be aware. There are at least 2 conflicting versions at play here.
One thing all the histories definitely agree on is that Te Rongo was a rangatira in her own right, and so marrying her must have been a major coup for Blenkinsop.
Yeah, his connection to Te Rongo, who was Ngāti Mutunga through her father, also gave him connections to several high-ranking Ngāti Toa chiefs, including Te Rauparaha himself, as well as Toarangatira of other allied tribes.
So he basically got all the connections he could want just from this one marriage. But on the other side, this marriage was also a coup for Te Rongo and her whānau, because back in the early 19th century, building connections with Pakeha traders like Blenkinsop was literally a matter of life and death. There was another early Pakeha immigrant called Frederick Manning, and he wrote this about his time living with Māori in the 1830s.
In those days, the value of a Pakeha to a tribe was enormous. For want of Pakehas to trade with and from whom to procure gunpowder and muskets, many tribes, or sections of tribes, were about this time exterminated, or nearly so, by their more fortunate neighbours who got Pakehas before them, and who consequently became armed with muskets first. A Pakeha trader who was therefore of a value, say, about 20 times his own weight in muskets.
In 1829, Blenkinsop sailed into Wellington Harbour on board the Caroline, and, if you know Wellington, made landfall around what's now Woodward Street and Lambton Quay. It was also the site of Kumutoto Pa, where Ngāti Mutunga lived. But Te Rongo and Blenkinsop soon moved across the Cook Strait.
Te Rauparaha had looked south and seen new opportunities for expansion, especially given iwi living at the top of the South Island had yet to get their hands on large numbers of muskets.
From 1827 to 1831, Te Rauparaha led a series of waka-born raids into the top of the South Island, attacking tribes living in that area, including Rangihaeata, Ngāti Kuia and later Ngaitahu.
One reason for this invasion was to gain access to the trade in pounamu, or greenstone, which was controlled by Ngaitahu, because if there was one thing as valuable to Māori in this period as muskets, it was pounamu.
But that first campaign in 1827 also gave him claim to the flat, fertile plains around the Wairau River, home to Rangitāne or Wairau.
In Wairau, Ngāti Toa seized thousands upon thousands of acres of rich soil that was to hold such a deadly appeal to so many people, including John Blenkinsop.
In 1832, Blenkinsop's ship was berthed at Te Koko o Kupe, or Cloudy Bay, at the mouth of the Wairau River. He leveraged his marriage with Te Rongo to make deals with the Rangihaeata in the district, including Te Rauparaha. He wanted rights to water and timber. Here's Ngāti Toa leader, Kahuropata.
My understanding is that, there was a relationship there, obviously one of trust initially in terms of our iwi and our people.
So this next bit's going to get a bit complicated. Just hang with us for a bit. An 18-pounder cannon from Sydney had been traded with Te Rauparaha's brother, Nohorua, in exchange for permission to set up a whaling station at Kakapo Bay, east of modern-day Picton. According to some versions of the story, this deal was made by the famous whaler and sealer Jackie Guard. Others say it was Blenkinsop himself who made the deal.
Either way, Blenkinsop is then supposed to have stolen the cannon from Nohorua and used it in a second deal with Te Rauparaha and others for access to land in Wairau. This cannon, by the way, today it sits outside the Marlborough District Council.
But the fact this cannon was seemingly stolen wasn't the only dodgy part of this deal.
So, what was the really dodgy bit? Well, the Māori who signed this deed thought they were just granting Blenkinsop the right to live in the area, chop down some trees, collect water, that sort of thing.
As far as my understanding was, it was like a rental. That there were some people, he was told that there's some people here going to use your land, and if you sign this paper, you'll get this, this and that. So obviously there is some understandings lost in translation there, but I think Blenkinsop had worked out that the Wairau was a place of huge resource and fertility in terms of the land. Ngāti Toa had recognised that from our initial arrival, and in fact it was like considered a personal pantry.
But Blenkinsop seems to have pulled a fast one here, because it appears that none of the rangatira who signed this document could read in English.
Yes, remember the language barriers?
Yeah. And the thing is, this document didn't just say that Blenkinsop was getting some kind of rental agreement with permission to cut down trees and take some water. The deed said that he was getting ownership of the entire Wairau plain.
that piece?
That's some 26,000 acres of land.
Head of Cloudy Bay in the island of New Zealand, aforesaid comprising the whole of the Wairau Plains, bounded on the south by a range of mountains extending in a westerly direction.
For a deceptive deed, it's pretty detailed.
All the ways, the paths, passages, waters, watercourses, trees, woods, underwoods, fences, commons...
Eventually, though, this whole deception, it was revealed. Te Rauparaha, he got a flax trader in Kapiti to read the document for him, and when he heard what it said, he was furious.
Yeah, I don't blame him. He rips up his copy of the deed and throws it away. Some say he burned it.
But by then, Blenkinsop has already sailed for Sydney with his copy of the document.
Yeah, he's out of there. Then, new twist, Blenkinsop drowns in the Murray River, although the impact of his dodgy deed would live on long after him.
Yeah, don't forget about that deed. It's going to be important later. So anyway, after Blenkinsop dies, Te Rongo remarries, although it's a little bit uncertain who she gets married to.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So in one account, she marries a man called Te Whaiti. Now, he was the first cousin to Te Rangihaeata, who's Te Rauparaha's nephew. After just a few years of marriage, Te Whaiti would die, and Te Rongo would be taken in by Te Rangihaeata. Now, they're usually described as husband and wife, but it was probably more like Te Rangihaeata had a natural responsibility to look after Te Rongo after the death of his cousin.
But like we said, slightly different versions of this history, and in another account, Te Whaiti doesn't marry Te Rongo. Instead, he marries Te Rongo Pāmamao. Remember, there's conflicting histories about whether Te Rongo and Te Rongo Pāmamao are two different women or the same person. We don't know for sure.
So both versions of the history agree that Te Rongo did eventually marry Te Rangihaeata. It's just a little uncertain whether she married Te Whaiti first.
Now, you might wonder why we're mentioning Te Whaiti. Well, just like Te Rongo, Te Whaiti had acted as a conduit between the Pakeha and Māori worlds, although in his case, he'd done so on the other side of the globe.
Yeah, Te Whaiti had travelled to England in the 1830s, and for a couple of years he lived with a guy who was extremely famous. Or maybe it would be better to say extremely infamous in the history of New Zealand. Edward Gibbon Wakefield, the founder and driving force behind the New Zealand Company.
So, what the hell was the New Zealand Company, I hear you ask? Well, let's introduce them.
Warm weather, a calm harbour, lots of plant life. The 3 shiploads of settlers and surveyors who arrived at Whakatū at the top of the South Island in late 1841 had a pretty good first impression of the place they intended to call home.
Arthur Thompson, in his 1859 book, The Story of New Zealand, declared the new arrivals were, quote, delighted with the calm atmosphere of Nelson, which is what they called Whakatū. But the man leading them, Captain Arthur Wakefield, he was anxious. As a new principal agent for the New Zealand Company, he'd left Britain with fewer settlers than hoped. And upon arrival, the new New Zealand governor, William Hobson, told him he couldn't build his town down in Canterbury where he'd wanted to, and perhaps most worryingly of all, Whakatū backed onto mountains, and it lacked the flat farming land which had been promised to the settlers.
Not just promised, they'd actually been sold the land back in Britain.
Yeah, but there was one big chunky problem. The New Zealand Company didn't own the land they were selling.
But we'll get to that in just a second. So the whole idea of the New Zealand Company had been dreamed up by Arthur's older brother, Edward Gibbon Wakefield. Here's Philip Temple, author of a biography of the Wakefield family. It's called A Sort of Conscience, The Wakefields.
He was quite a charismatic figure. A lot of people were quite bewitched by his ideas and his energy and that sort of thing. And I suggested from certain bits of evidence that he might have been bipolar.
Edward Gibbon Wakefield had political ambitions, but had also experienced personal tragedy.
Edward Gibbon lost his first wife in childbirth when Jerningham was born, and it was just before she was due to inherit all this money, which would have enabled him to become a member of Parliament, because in those days you needed a lot of cash.
6 years after the death of Eliza, his first wife, Edward's political dreams was still the driving force in his life. So he and his brother William hatched a plan to get hold of that cash. Abduct a 15-year-old heiress called Ellen Turner, marry her, and use her family's money to get into Parliament.
He was desperate to actually participate in political life. So he thought, I've got to find somebody else to get the money. And he eloped or abducted Ellen Turner, and William helped him. So they were complicit in this scheme to pick up this 15-year-old girl from school. In those days in Scotland, Gretna Green, you could marry at the age of 12. You just had to say, yes, I do.
So I find the craziest part of the story that, like, Edward Gibbon and William's plan really hinged on the idea that this 15-year-old girl's family would just go along with this. That, like, after they'd abducted and married their daughter, they're just going to go, sweet, okay, well, here's a whole bunch of money and you can go to Parliament. It's just nuts.
I know, it's just this whole thing about dowry, isn't it? Because she comes with a dowry to help fund his political aspirations.
Yeah.
Well, the law didn't think so either, and both William and Edward Gibbon Wakefield were charged with abduction. It was the biggest scandal Britain had seen in years. Here's a reenactment of the trial from RNZ's Spectrum program in 1975.
The defendants stand charged before you with conspiring together to carry away a young female under the age of 16 from the custody of her parents and instructors, and afterwards to marry her to one of the offenders. That is the crime for which the defendants are now...
Okay, we don't have time to go through this whole trial, but long story short, the Wakefield brothers are both convicted and sentenced to 2 years in the slammer. But then, while he's in jail, Edward Gibbon Wakefield is just horrified by what he sees. You know, petty criminals shipped off to penal colonies, people being hanged for low-level crimes. So he reads really widely, and he comes up with an idea to fix all this, some kind of reform. Now, here's historian Vincent O'Malley, author of the New Zealand Wars, Ngā Pakanga o Aotearoa.
During his time in jail, he develops this idea about what he calls systematic colonisation, and that's based on his theory of a sufficient price, which is that land should be sold to intending migrants at a price that was sufficient to ensure that only the richer members of society could afford to buy those lands, while it would also subsidise the migration of the labouring classes. So it was intended to kind of replicate an idealised version of the English class system in a way.
Ah yes, a new Britannia. Edward Gibbon writes it all up in an article entitled Cure and Prevention of Pauperism by Means of Systematic Colonisation.
And a few rich and influential people who read this article thought it sounded just like a great idea. So Edward Gibbon Wakefield becomes the head of a new organisation, the New Zealand Company.
So the New Zealand Company is a really critical part of the story. It's founded in 1839, following an early New Zealand Association in 1837, and this is really colonisation by a private company. They have they gain a monopoly right to acquire large areas of land for Māori and sell it to settlers.
The New Zealand Company set their sights on a country nearly 12,000 miles away. Cue the propaganda. There's brochures, a prospectus, even a larger-than-life artwork you can step into to really feel like you're there. Here's a snippet of one of their ads.
Emigration to New Zealand. The directors of the New Zealand Land Company hereby give notice that they're ready to receive applications for a free passage to their first and principal settlement. The company's emigrant ships will sail from England early in September next. Further particulars and printed forms of application may be obtained at the company's offices by order of the directors. Number 1, Adelphi.
The New Zealand company uses everything in its power to entice buyers. Here's Senior Lecturer Lloyd Carpenter again.
They would have town hall meetings where the media of the day, which was these beautifully produced artworks showing, come on in, the natives are friendly and the weather's good and you can grow bananas in the Hutt Valley and things like that. That was said, by the way. And they would basically come round and they would persuade people. They had too many people. It was this idea, we have too many mouths to feed in England, so let's ship them overseas. And so the same principle applied to providing settlers for Canada, for Australia, parts of America and the Caribbean. But New Zealand, you had the chance to provide settlers and make money off them. So as far as the aristocracy was concerned, this was win-win. We get rid of these annoying mouths to feed and we can make some coin along the way because we come along, we persuade the uneducated natives of New Zealand to part with their land, and then we will farm it, we will make money out of it, and then we'll sell it to the new settlers, and all along the way we clip the ticket and make profit.
So you can kind of think of the New Zealand company as two distinct groups. There's the rich folks who are back in England buying up the land, and then there's the working class folks who are being sent out to work on that land.
But hang on, there's a big problem here. The New Zealand company are selling land they don't own. They haven't even visited the land they are trying to sell.
Although they have talked to a few people who know these islands better than they do, including Te Whaiti, the guy who may or may not have married Te Rongo after the death of her first husband, John Blenkinsop.
As we mentioned, Te Whaiti had lived with Edward Gibbon Wakefield for a couple of years.
But either the company just completely ignored what Te Whaiti had to say, or something got seriously lost in translation, because the company said a lot of stuff about New Zealand which was totally bananas.
Literally bananas. Like Lloyd said, at one point the company claimed bananas were growing all through the Hutt Valley.
I don't know if you've been to the Hutt Valley recently. Not that many bananas. Te Whaiti was a real drawcard for Edward Gibbon Wakefield to help promote his colonisation scheme. He was quoted, maybe accurately, maybe inaccurately, as saying Māori would welcome the New Zealand company's project. He's supposed to have said,
I like it. I do not know what my countrymen would like. I think they would like it too, because they like even the bad people now. I think they would like the gentlemen.
And in the context of his time, that's not a crazy thing for Te Whaiti to have said. Like we mentioned before, building relations with Pakeha was extremely important for Māori, and Te Whaiti couldn't have known the level of chaos the so-called gentlemen of the New Zealand company were about to unleash.
But some in Britain did see what was coming. Senior officials in the Colonial Office were convinced the New Zealand company's scheme would end in tears, not just for the settlers, but also for Māori. One even went so far as to say it would inevitably lead to the, quote, conquest and extermination of the present inhabitants.
Which is in part why the Brits sent William Hobson over to Aotearoa in early 1840 to sign the Treaty of Waitangi. The treaty included a provision to block unscrupulous speculators like the New Zealand company buying Māori land. Hobson's orders from London were to bring law and order to the country and buy land from Māori by, quote, fair and equal contracts, crack down on the dodgy deals.
Here's Senior Lecturer Lloyd Carpenter again.
The New Zealand company regarded the treaty as an annoying encumbrance at best and something to be ignored. They were selling land, for example, in the Hutt Valley, that they didn't own, got here and hurriedly came up with deals with Ngāti Toa, with Te Atiawa and other Wellington iwi that supposedly gained them the right to settle.
So the New Zealand company's approach was simple. Buy up as much land as they could before the Treaty of Waitangi was signed.
In fact, in just the few months before the signing of the treaty, Edward Gibbon's brother William Wakefield, he bought up about a third of the land in New Zealand. That's an area of land about the size of Ireland. Or at least he thinks he buys this land. Here's Vincent O'Malley.
Yeah, so William Wakefield is dispatched on the Tory soon after the company is founded He arrives, identifies the Cook Strait region as one that the New Zealand company would be interested in acquiring, and he enters into a number of deals.
The biggest deal is called the Kapiti Deed, which covers the entire lower North Island and the top of the South Island.
The deed is signed in October 1839 between William Wakefield, Te Rauparaha and other Rangihaeata of Ngāti Toa, and it purports to convey to the New Zealand company all of the lands between northern Taranaki down to North Canterbury, basically, around 20 million acres, 1/3 of the country. In return, Ngāti Toa receive guns, ammunition, various tools and utensils.
But these deeds meant something else to Māori.
Well, the notion of a land sale is foreign to Māori tikanga. The way that Māori were more likely to understand the transaction is that they are forging a relationship with the newcomers, agreeing to share the lands and resources on them between the two parties. And so in that sense, not a permanent alienation of the lands. And that's a different way of thinking about the transaction. It's not a one-off real estate deal. It's about the relationships between the parties.
So into this mess we now throw several thousand New Zealand company settlers who have no idea what they're walking into.
On the 1st of February 1842, the first ship, Fifesha, arrived carrying 159 colonists, and within 18 months, another 18 ships would follow.
Here's Lloyd Carpenter again.
So when they arrive there, they don't have a lot of cash, and they also don't have opportunity to work, because it's a basic trading society without anything to trade. Local Māori are very kind in supporting them, showing them how to plant mara. There's this idea that it was a happy little settlement. It wasn't. It was founded on tragedy. The first ship arrived with the men on board, and they were the ones that put up the prefabricated housing and that. The second ship was the Lloyds, and that arrived, and with stories of absolute horror. 65 children died on it. That meant out of every family that was in the new settlement of Nelson, there was either someone who lost a child or someone who knew someone who lost a child. The women were assaulted, which in the Victorian parlance meant everything from sexual assault to rape. And they arrived, they were damaged. And they arrive, and instead of finding this wonderful place that they can start a new life that was different to the life they faced in England, they faced hardship, in some cases close to starvation, and almost a dream that hadn't even come close to coming true.
So you've got thousands of frustrated, struggling settlers in Nelson, and alongside them you had increasingly annoyed Māori having to adapt to life alongside a rapidly growing Pakeha population.
As you might expect, there were cultural clashes on many fronts, including the law.
The Māori and British approaches to justice were dramatically different, and quite how different they were was brought to light by the murder of a Ngāti Toa woman, Rangihaeata, and her 18-month-old baby in December 1842. The case was heard in April 1843. Here's Media Pōmari again.
A Pakeha, Richard Cook, who was a trader from the Wairau, and while everybody knew that this person, Richard Cook, was responsible for Kuika's death, including Richard Cook's wife, she knew he was guilty, but was prevented from giving evidence by virtue of the fact that they were married, and wives were prevented from giving evidence against their husbands under English law. So the case completely fell apart, and Richard Cook was exonerated. He was allowed to leave the country freely with no repercussions.
Here's Vincent O'Malley.
The local missionary Samuel Ironside convinces Ngāti Toa not to exact utu on Richard Cook, but to let the rule of law apply and justice will be done for all. The case against Cook collapses because the Crown hasn't bothered to gather evidence from any of the many other Māori who could have testified that Cook was indeed the person who had brutally raped and murdered this woman. He walks free